This podcast is part of the audiobook edition of The Discovery of India, produced by Giribala Joshi, using advanced text-to-speech technology.
Chapter 7, The Last Phase, 1. Part 7, The Great Revolt of 1857, Racialism. After nearly a century of British rule, Bengal had accommodated itself to it, the peasantry devastated by famine and crushed by new economic burdens, the new intelligentsia looking to the west and hoping that progress would come through English liberalism. So also, more or less in the south and in western India, in Madras and Bombay. But in the upper provinces, there was no such submission or accommodation, and the spirit of revolt was growing, especially among the feudal chiefs and their followers. Even in the masses, discontent and an intense anti-British feeling were widespread. The upper classes keenly resented the insulting and overbearing manners of the foreigners. The people generally suffered from the rapacity and ignorance of the officials of the East India Company, who ignored their time-honored customs and paid no heed to what the people of the country thought. Absolute power over vast numbers of people had turned their heads, and they suffered no check or hindrance. Even the new judicial system they introduced became a thing of terror because of its complications and the ignorance of the judges of both the language and customs of the country. As early as 1817, Sir Thomas Munro, writing to the Governor-General, Lord Hastings, after pointing out the advantages of British rule, said, "But these advantages are dearly bought. They are purchased by the sacrifice of independence, of national character, and of whatever renders a people respectable. The consequence, therefore, of the conquest of India by the British arms would be, in place of raising, to debase a whole people. There is perhaps no example of any conquest in which the natives have been so completely excluded from all share of the government of their country as in British India." Munro was pleading for the employment of Indians in the administration. A year later, he wrote again, "Foreign conquerors have treated the natives with violence, and often with great cruelty, but none has treated them with so much scorn as we, none has stigmatized the whole people as unworthy of trust, as incapable of honesty, and as fit to be employed only where we cannot do without them. It seems to be not only ungenerous, but impolitic, to debase the character of a people fallen under our dominion." Footnote, quoted by Edward Thompson in The Making of the Indian Princes, 1943. End of footnote. British dominion was extended to the Punjab by 1850 after two Sikh wars. Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who had held and extended the Sikh state in the Punjab, had died in 1839. In 1856, Awadh was annexed. Awadh had been virtually under British rule for half a century, for it was a vassal state, its nominal ruler being both helpless and degenerate, and the British resident all-powerful. It had sunk to the very depths of misery and illustrated all the evils of the subsidiary state system. In May 1857, the Indian Army at Meerut mutinied. The revolt had been secretly and well organized, but a premature outburst rather upset the plans of the leaders. It was much more than a military mutiny, and it spread rapidly and assumed the character of a popular rebellion and a war of Indian independence. As such a popular rebellion of the masses, it was confined to Delhi, the United Provinces, as they are now called, and parts of central India and Bihar. Essentially it was a feudal outburst, headed by feudal chiefs and their followers and aided by the widespread anti-foreign sentiment. Inevitably it looked up to the relic of the Mughal dynasty, still sitting in the Delhi palace, but feeble and old and powerless. Both Hindus and Muslims took full part in the revolt. This revolt strained British rule to the utmost, and it was ultimately suppressed with Indian help. It brought out all the inherent weaknesses of the old regime, which was making its last despairing effort to drive out foreign rule. The feudal chiefs had the sympathy of the masses over large areas, but they were incapable, unorganized, and with no constructive ideal or community of interest. They had already played their role in history, and there was no place for them in the future. Many of their number, in spite of their sympathies, thought discretion the better part of valor, and stood apart waiting to see on which side victory lay. Many played the part of quislings. The Indian princes as a whole kept aloof or helped the British, fearing to risk what they had acquired or managed to retain. There was hardly any national and unifying sentiment among the leaders, and a mere anti-foreign feeling, coupled with a desire to maintain their feudal privileges, was a poor substitute for this. The British got the support of the Gurkhas, and what is much more surprising, of the Sikhs also, for the Sikhs had been their enemies and had been defeated by them only a few years before. It is certainly to the credit of the British that they could win over the Sikhs in this way. Whether it is to the credit or discredit of the Sikhs of those days depends upon one's point of view. It is clear, however, that there was a lack of nationalist feeling which might have bound the people of India together. Nationalism of the modern type was yet to come. India had still to go through much sorrow and travail before she learnt the lesson which would give her real freedom. Not by fighting for a lost cause, the feudal order, would freedom come. The revolt threw up some fine guerrilla leaders. Feroz Shah, a relative of Bahadur Shah, of Delhi, was one of them, but, most brilliant of all was Tatya Tope, who harassed the British for many months even when defeat stared him in the face. Ultimately, when he crossed the Narmada River into the Maratha regions, hoping to receive aid and welcome from his own people, there was no welcome, and he was betrayed. One name stands out above others and is revered still in popular memory, the name of Lakshmi Bai, Rani of Jhansi, a girl of 20 years of age, who died fighting. Best and bravest of the rebel leaders, she was called by the English general who opposed her. British memorials of the mutiny have been put up in Kanpur and elsewhere. There is no memorial for the Indians who died. The rebel Indians sometimes indulged in cruel and barbarous behavior. They were unorganized, suppressed, and often angered by reports of British excesses. But there is another side to the picture also that impressed itself on the mind of India, and in my own province especially the memory of it persists in town and village. One would like to forget all this, for it is ghastly and horrible picture showing man at his worst, even according to the new standards of barbarity set up by Nazism and modern war. But it can only be forgotten, or remembered in a detached impersonal way, when it becomes truly the past with nothing to connect it with the present. So long as the connecting links and reminders are present, and the spirit behind those events survives and shows itself, that memory also will endure and influence our people. Attempts to suppress that picture do not destroy it, but drive it deeper in the mind. Only by dealing with it normally can its effect be lessened. A great deal of false and perverted history has been written about the revolt and its suppression. What the Indians think about it seldom finds its way to the printed page. Sawarkar wrote the history of the War of Indian Independence some 30 years ago, but his book was promptly banned, and is banned still. Some frank and honorable English historians have occasionally lifted the veil, and allowed us a glimpse of the race mania and lynching mentality which prevailed on an enormous scale. The accounts given in Kay and Mallison's History of the Mutiny and in Thompson and Garrett's Rise and Fulfillment of British Rule in India make one sick with horror. Every Indian who was not actually fighting for the British became a murderer of women and children, a general massacre of the inhabitants of Delhi, a large number of whom were known to wish us success, was openly proclaimed. The days of Timur and Nadir Shah were remembered, but their exploits were eclipsed by the new terror, both in extent and the length of time it lasted. Looting was officially allowed for a week, but it actually lasted for a month, and it was accompanied by wholesale massacre. In my own city and district of Allahabad and in the neighborhood, General Neil held his bloody assizes. Soldiers and civilians alike were holding bloody assize, or slaying natives without any assize at all, regardless of age or sex. It is on the records of our British Parliament, in papers sent home by the Governor-General in Council, that the aged, women, and children are sacrificed as well as those guilty of rebellion. They were not deliberately hanged, but burnt to death in villages, perhaps now and then accidentally shot. Volunteer hanging parties went into the districts and amateur executioners were not wanting to the occasion. One gentleman boasted of the numbers he had finished off quite in an artistic manner, with mango trees as gibbets and elephants for drops, the victims of this wild justice being strung up, as though for pastime, in the form of figures of 8. And so in Kanpur and Lucknow and all over the place. It is hateful to have to refer to this past history, but the spirit behind those events did not end with them. It survived, and whenever a crisis comes or nerves give way, it is in evidence again. The world knows about Amritsar and Jallianwala Bagh, but it does not know of much that has happened since the days of the mutiny, much that has taken place even in recent years and in our time, which has embittered the present generation. Imperialism and the domination of one people over another is bad, and so is racialism. But imperialism plus racialism can only lead to horror, and ultimately to the degradation of all concerned with them. The future historians of England will have to consider how far England's decline from her proud eminence was due to her imperialism and racialism, which corrupted her public life and made her forget the lessons of her own history and literature. Since Hitler emerged from obscurity and became the Führer of Germany, we have heard a great deal about racialism and the Nazi theory of the Herrenvolk. That doctrine has been condemned and is today condemned by the leaders of the United Nations. Biologists tell us that racialism is a myth and there is no such thing as a master race. But we in India have known racialism in all its forms ever since the commencement of British rule. The whole ideology of this rule was that of the Heron folk and the master race, and the structure of government was based upon it. Indeed, the idea of a master race is inherent in imperialism. There was no subterfuge about it, it was proclaimed in unambiguous language by those in authority. More powerful than words was the practice that accompanied them, and generation after generation and year after year, India as a nation and Indians as individuals were subjected to insult, humiliation, and contemptuous treatment. The English were an imperial race, we were told, with the God-given right to govern us and keep us in subjection. If we protested, we were reminded of the tiger qualities of an imperial race. As an Indian, I am ashamed to write all this, for the memory of it hurts, and what hurts still more is the fact that we submitted for so long to this degradation. I would have preferred any kind of resistance to this, whatever the consequences, rather than that our people should endure this treatment. And yet it is better that both Indians and Englishmen should know it, for that is the psychological background of England's connection with India, and psychology counts and racial memories are long. One rather typical quotation will make us realize how most of the English in India have felt and acted. At the time of the Ilbert Bill agitation in 1883, Seton Kerr, who had been Foreign Secretary to the Government of India, declared that this bill outraged the cherished conviction, which was shared by every Englishman in India, from the highest to the lowest, by the planter's assistant in his lowly bungalow, and by the editor in the full light of the presidency town, from those to the chief commissioner in charge of an important province and to the viceroy on his throne, the conviction in every man that he belongs to a race whom God has destined to govern and subdue. Footnote, quoted in Rise and Fulfillment of British Rule in India, Edward Thompson and G. T. Garrett, London, 1935. End of footnote. End of Part 7, titled, The Great Revolt of 1857, Racialism, of Chapter 7. Part 8, The Techniques of British Rule, Balance and Counterpoise. The revolt of 1857-58 was essentially a feudal rising, though there were some nationalistic elements in it. Yet, at the same time, it was due to the abstention or active help of the princes and other feudal chiefs that the British succeeded in crushing it. Those who had joined the revolt were, as a rule, the disinherited and those deprived of their power and privileges by the British authority, or those who feared that some such fate was in store for them. British policy after some hesitation had decided in favor of a gradual elimination of the princes and the establishment of direct British rule. The revolt brought about a change in this policy in favor not only of the princes, but of the talukdars or big landlords. It was felt that it was easier to control the masses through these feudal or semi-feudal chiefs. These talukdars of Awadh had been the tax farmers of the Mughals, but owing to the weakness of the central authority, they had begun to function as feudal landlords. Nearly all of them joined the revolt, though some took care to keep a way of escape open. In spite of their rebellion, the British authority offered to reinstate them, with a few exceptions, and confirm them in their estates on conditions of loyalty and good service. Thus these talukdars, who take pride in calling themselves the Barons of Awadh, became one of the pillars of British rule. Though the revolt had directly affected only certain parts of the country, it had shaken up the whole of India, and particularly, the British administration. The government set about reorganizing their entire system. The British Crown, that is the Parliament, took over the country from the East India Company. The Indian Army, which had begun the revolt by its mutiny, was organized afresh. The techniques of British rule, which had already been well established, were now clarified and confirmed and deliberately acted upon. Essentially these were, the creation and protection of vested interests bound up with British rule, a policy of balancing and counterpoise of different elements, and the encouragement of vociferous tendencies and division amongst them. The princes and the big landlords were the basic vested interests thus created and encouraged, but now a new class, even more tied up with British rule, grew in importance. This consisted of the Indian members of the services, usually in subordinate positions. Previously the employment of Indians had been avoided except when this could not be helped, and Monroe had pleaded for such employment. Experience had now demonstrated that Indians employed were so dependent on the British administration and rule that they could be relied upon and treated as agents of that rule. In the pre-mutiny days, most of the Indian members of the subordinate services had been Bengalis. These had spread out over the upper provinces wherever the British administration needed clerks and the like in its civil or military establishments. Regular colonies of Bengalis had thus grown up at the administrative or military centers in the United Provinces, Delhi, and even in the Punjab. These Bengalis accompanied the British armies and proved faithful employees to them. They became associated in the minds of the rebels with the British power, and were greatly disliked by them, and given uncomplimentary titles. Thus began the process of the Indianization of the administrative machine in its subordinate ranks, all real power and initiative being, however, concentrated in the hands of the English personnel. As English education spread, the Bengalis had no longer a virtual monopoly of service, and other Indians came in, both on the judicial and executive sides of the administration. This Indianization became the most effective method of strengthening British rule. It created a civil army and garrison everywhere, which was more important even than the military army of occupation. There were some members of this civil army who were able and patriotic and nationalistically inclined, but like the soldier, who also may be patriotic in his individual capacity, they were bound up by the army code and discipline, and the price of disobedience, desertion, and revolt was heavy. Not only was this civil army created, but the hope and prospect of employment in it affected and demoralized a vast and growing number of others. There was a measure of prestige and security in it and a pension at the end of the term of service, and if a sufficient subservience was shown to one's superior officers, other failings did not count. These civil employees were the intermediaries between the British authorities and the people, and if they had to be obsequious to their superiors they could be arrogant too, and exact obedience from their own inferiors and the people at large. The lack of other avenues of employment, other ways of making a living, added additional importance to government service. A few could become lawyers or doctors, but even so, success was by no means assured. Industry hardly existed. Trade was largely in the hands of certain hereditary classes, who had a peculiar aptitude for it, and who helped each other. The new education did not fit anyone for trade or industry, its chief aim was government service. Education was so limited as to offer few openings for a professional career, other social services were almost non-existent. So government service remained, and as the colleges poured out their graduates, even the growing government services could not absorb them all, and a fierce competition arose. The unemployed graduates and others formed a pool, from which government could always draw. They were a potential threat to the security of even the employed. Thus the British government in India became, not only the biggest employer, but, for all practical purposes, the sole big employer, including railways, and a vast bureaucratic machine was built up, strictly managed and controlled at the top. This enormous patronage was exercised to strengthen the British hold on the country, to crush discordant and disagreeable elements, and to promote rivalry and discord amongst various groups anxiously looking forward to employment in government service. It led to demoralization and conflict, and the government could play one group against the other. The policy of balance and counterpoise was deliberately furthered in the Indian Army. Various groups were so arranged as to prevent any sentiment of national unity growing up amongst them, and tribal and communal loyalties and slogans were encouraged. Every effort was made to isolate the army from the people, and even ordinary newspapers were not allowed to reach the Indian troops. All the key positions were kept in the hands of Englishmen, and no Indian could hold the King's commission. A raw English subaltern was senior to the oldest and most experienced Indian non-commissioned officer or those holding the so-called Viceroy's commissions. No Indian could be employed at army headquarters except as a petty clerk in the accounts department. For additional protection, the more effective weapons of warfare were not given to the Indian forces, they were reserved for the British troops in India. These British troops were always kept with the Indian regiments in all the vital centres of India to serve as internal security troops for suppression of disorder and to overawe the people. While this internal army, with a predominance of British personnel, served as an army of occupation for the country, the greater portion of the Indian troops were part of the field army organised for service abroad. The Indian troops were recruited from special classes only, chiefly in northern India, which were called martial classes. Again we notice in India that inherent contradiction in British rule. Having brought about the political unification of the country, and thus let loose new dynamic forces, which thought not only in terms of that unity, but aimed at the freedom of India, the British government tried to disrupt that very unity it had helped to create. That disruption was not thought of in political terms then as a splitting up of India, it was aimed at the weakening of nationalist elements so that British rule might continue over the whole country. But it was nonetheless an attempt at disruption, by giving greater importance to the Indian states than they had ever had before, by encouraging reactionary elements and looking to them for support, by promoting divisions and encouraging one group against another, by encouraging vociferous tendencies due to religion or province, and by organizing quisling classes, which were afraid of a change which might engulf them. All this was a natural, understandable policy for a foreign imperialist power to pursue, and it is a little naive to be surprised at it, harmful from the Indian nationalist point of view though it was. But the fact that it was so must be remembered if we are to understand subsequent developments. Out of this policy arose those important elements in India's national life of which we are reminded so often today, which were created and encouraged to disagree and disrupt, and are now called upon to agree among themselves. Because of this natural alliance of the British power with the reactionaries in India, it became the guardian and upholder of many an evil custom and practice which it otherwise condemned. India was custom-ridden when the British came, and the tyranny of old custom is often a terrible thing. Yet customs change and are forced to adapt themselves to some extent to a changing environment. Hindu law was largely custom, and as custom changed, the law also was applied in a different way. Indeed, there was no provision of Hindu law which could not be changed by custom. The British replaced this elastic customary law by judicial decisions based on the old texts, and these decisions became precedents which had to be rigidly followed. That was, in theory, an advantage, as it produced greater uniformity and certainty. But, in the manner it was done, it resulted in the perpetuation of the ancient law unmodified by subsequent customs. Thus, the old law which, in some particulars and in various places, had been changed by custom and was thus out of date, was petrified, and every tendency to change it in the well-known customary way was suppressed. It was still open to a group to prove a custom overriding the law, but this was extraordinarily difficult in the law courts. Change could only come by positive legislation, but the British government, which was the legislating authority, had no wish to antagonize the conservative elements on whose support it counted. When later some legislative powers were given to partially elected assemblies, every attempt to promote social reform legislation was frowned upon by the authorities and sternly discouraged. End of Part 8, titled, The Techniques of British Rule, Balance and Counterpoise, of Chapter 7. Part 9, Growth of Industry, Provincial Differences. Slowly India recovered from the after-effects of the revolt of 1857-58. Despite British policy, powerful forces were at work changing India, and a new social consciousness was arising. The political unity of India, contact with the West, technological advances, and even the misfortune of a common subjection, led to new currents of thought, the slow development of industry, and the rise of a new movement for national freedom. The awakening of India was twofold: she looked to the West, and at the same time, she looked at herself and her own past. The coming of the railway to India brought the industrial age on its positive side, so far only the negative aspect, in the shape of manufactured goods from Britain, had been in evidence. In 1860 the duty on imported machinery, imposed so as to prevent the industrialization of India, was removed, and large-scale industry began to develop, chiefly with British capital. First came the jute industry of Bengal, with its nerve centre at Dundee in Scotland. Much later, cotton mills grew up in Ahmedabad and Bombay, largely with Indian capital and under Indian ownership. Then came mining. Obstruction from the British government in India continued, and an excise duty was put on Indian cotton goods to prevent them from competing with Lancashire textiles, even in India. Nothing, perhaps, reveals the police state policy of the Government of India more than the fact that they had no Department of Agriculture, and no Department of Commerce and Industry till the 20th century. It was, I believe, chiefly due to the donation of an American visitor, given for agricultural improvement in India, that a Department of Agriculture was started in the central government. Even now this department is a very small affair. A Department for Commerce and Industry followed soon after, in 1905. Even then these departments functioned in a very small way. The growth of industry was artificially restricted, and India's natural economic development was arrested. Though the masses of India were desperately poor and growing poorer, a tiny fringe at the top was prospering under the new conditions and accumulating capital. It was this fringe that demanded political reform, as well as opportunities for investment. On the political side, the Indian National Congress was started in 1885. Commerce and industry grew slowly, and it is interesting to note that the classes who took to them were predominantly those whose hereditary occupations for hundreds of years had been trade and commerce. Ahmedabad, the new center of the textile industry, had been a famous manufacturing and trade center during the Mughal period and even earlier, exporting its products to foreign countries. The big merchants of Ahmedabad had their own ships for this seaborne trade to Africa and the Persian Gulf. Bharuch, the seaport nearby, was well known in Greco-Roman times. The people of Gujarat, Kathiawar, and Kutch were traders, manufacturers, merchants, and seafaring folk from ancient times. Many changes took place in India, but they carried on with their old business, adapting them to new conditions. They are now among the most prominent leaders in industry and commerce. Religion or a change of religion made no difference. The Parsis, who originally settled in Gujarat 1300 years ago, may be considered as Gujaratis for this purpose. Their language has long been Gujarati. Among the Muslims, the most prominent sects in business and industry are the Khojas, Memons, and Bohras. All of these are converts from Hinduism, and all come from Gujarat, Kathiawar, or Kutch. All these Gujaratis not only dominate industry and business in India, but have spread out to Burma, Ceylon, East Africa, South Africa, and other foreign countries. The Marwaris from Rajputana used to control internal trade and finance, and were to be found at all the nerve centers of India. They were the big financiers as well as the small village bankers. A note from a well-known Marwari financial house would be honored anywhere in India, and even abroad. The Marwaris still represent big finance in India but have added industry to it now. The Sindhis in the northwest have also an old commercial tradition, and with their headquarters at Shikarpur or Hyderabad they used to spread out over Central and Western Asia and elsewhere. Today, that is before the war, there is hardly a port anywhere in the world where one or more Sindhi shops cannot be found. Some of the Punjabis also have been traditionally in business. The Shettis of Madras have also been leaders in business, and banking especially, from ancient times. The word Shetti is derived from the Sanskrit Shreshti, the leader of a merchant guild. The common appellation site is also derived from Shreshti. The Madras Shettis have not only played an important part in South India, but they spread out all over Burma, even in the remoter villages. Within each province also trade and commerce were largely in the hands of the old Vaishya class, who had been engaged in business for untold generations. They were the retail and wholesale dealers and moneylenders. In each village there was a banias shop, which dealt in the necessaries of village life and advanced loans, on very profitable terms, to the villagers. The rural credit system was almost entirely in the hands of these banias. They spread even to the tribal and independent territories of the northwest and performed important functions there. As poverty grew, agricultural indebtedness also grew rapidly, and the moneylending establishments held mortgages on the land and eventually acquired much of it. Thus, the moneylender became the landlord also. These demarcations of commercial, trading, and banking classes from others became less clearly defined as newcomers crept into various business, but they continued and are still marked. Whether they are due to the caste system, or the hold of tradition, or inherited capacity, or all of these together, it is difficult to specify. Undoubtedly, among Brahmins and Kshatriyas business was looked down upon, and even the accumulation of money, though agreeable enough, was not a sufficient recompense. The possession of land was a symbol of social position, as in feudal times, and scholarship and learning were respected, even apart from possession. Under British rule, government service gave prestige, security, and status, and later, when Indians were allowed to enter the Indian civil service, this service, called the heaven-born service, heaven being some pale shadow of Whitehall, became the Elysium of the English educated classes. The professional classes, especially lawyers, some of whom earned large incomes in the new law courts, also had prestige and high status and attracted young men. Inevitably, these lawyers took the lead in political and social reform movements. The Bengalis were the first to take to the law, and some of them flourished exceedingly, and cast a glamour over their profession. They were also the political leaders. They did not fit into the growing industry, either because of lack of aptitude or other reasons. The result has been that when industry began to play an important part in the country's life and to influence politics, Bengal lost its preeminence in the political field. The old current, when Bengalis poured out of their province as government servants and in other capacities, was reversed and people from other provinces poured into Bengal, especially in Calcutta, and permeated the commercial and industrial life there. Calcutta had been and continues to be the chief centre of British capital and industry, and the English and the Scotch dominate business there, but they are being caught up by Marwaris and Gujaratis. Even petty trades in Calcutta are often in non-Bengali hands. All the thousands of taxi drivers in Calcutta, almost without an exception, are Sikhs from the Punjab. Bombay became the center and headquarters of Indian-owned industry, commerce, banking, insurance, etc. The Parsis, the Gujaratis, and Marwaris were the leaders in all these activities, and it is significant to note that the Maharashtrians or Marathas have played very little part in them. Bombay is a huge cosmopolitan city now, but its population consists mainly of Marathas and Gujaratis. The Marathas have distinguished themselves in the professions and in scholarship. They make, as one would expect, good soldiers, and large numbers of them are employed as workers in the textile mills. They are hardy and wiry, and as a province, poor. They are proud of the Shivaji tradition and of the achievements of their forefathers. The Gujaratis are soft in body, gentler, richer, and perfectly at home in trade and commerce. Perhaps these differences are largely due to geography, for the Maratha country is bare and hard and mountainous while Gujarat is rich and fertile. It is interesting to observe these and other differences in various parts of India which continue to persist, though they tend to grow less. Madras, highly intellectual, has produced and still produces distinguished philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists. Bombay is now almost entirely devoted to business with all its advantages and disadvantages. Bengal, rather backward in industry and business, has produced some fine scientists, and has especially distinguished itself in art and literature. The Punjab has produced no outstanding personalities, but is a go-ahead province advancing in many fields. Its people are hard-headed, make good mechanics, and are successful in small trades and petty industries. The United Provinces, including Delhi, are a curious amalgam, and in some ways an epitome of India. They are the seat of the old Hindu culture as well as of the Persian culture that came in Afghan and Mughal times, and hence the mixture of the two is most in evidence there, intermingled with the culture of the West. There is less of provincialism there than in any other part of India. For long they have considered themselves, and have been looked upon by others, as the heart of India. Indeed, in popular parlance, they are often referred to as Hindustan. These differences, it must be noted, are geographical and not religious. A Bengali Muslim is far nearer to a Bengali Hindu than he is to a Punjabi Muslim, so also with others. If a number of Hindu and Muslim Bengalis happen to meet anywhere, in India or elsewhere, they will immediately congregate together and feel at home with each other. Punjabis, whether Muslim or Hindu or Sikh, will do likewise. The Muslims of the Bombay Presidency, Khojas, Memons, and Bohras, have many Hindu customs. The Khojas, they are the followers of the Aga Khan, and the Bohras are not looked upon as orthodox by the Muslims of the north. Muslims, as a whole, especially in Bengal and the north, not only kept away from English education for a long time, but also took little part in the growth of industry. Partly, this was due to feudal modes of thought, partly, as in Roman Catholicism, to Islam's prohibition against usury and interest on money. But, curiously enough, among the notorious moneylenders are a particular tribe of Pathans, who come from near the frontier. Muslims were thus, in the second half of the 19th century, backward in English education and therefore in contact with Western thought, as also in government service and in industry. The growth of industry in India, slow and arrested as it was, gave the impression of progress and attracted attention. And yet it made practically no difference to the problem of the poverty of the masses and the overburden on the land. A few 100,000 workers were transferred to industry out of the scores of millions of the unemployed and partially employed. This changeover was so extremely small that it did not affect the increasing ruralization of the country. Widespread unemployment and the pressure on land led to emigration of workers on a substantial scale to foreign countries, often under humiliating conditions. They went to South Africa, Fiji, Trinidad, Jamaica, Guyana, Mauritius, Ceylon, Burma, and Malaya. The small groups or individuals who found opportunities for growth and betterment under foreign rule were divorced from the masses, whose condition continued to worsen. Some capital accumulated in the hands of these groups and conditions were gradually created for further growth. But the basic problems of poverty and unemployment remained untouched. End of Part 9, titled, Growth of Industry, Provincial Differences, of Chapter 7. Part 10, Reform and Other Movements Among Hindus and Muslims. The real impact of the West came to India in the 19th century through technical changes and their dynamic consequences. In the realm of ideas also, there was shock and change, a widening of the horizon which had so long been confined within a narrow shell. The first reaction, limited to the small English-educated class, was one of admiration and acceptance of almost everything Western. Repelled by some of the social customs and practices of Hinduism, many Hindus were attracted towards Christianity, and some notable conversions took place in Bengal. An attempt was therefore made by Raja Ram Mohan Roy to adapt Hinduism to this new environment, and he started the Brahmo Samaj on a more or less rationalist and social reform basis. His successors, Keshab Chandra Sen, gave it a more Christian outlook. The Brahmo Samaj influenced the rising middle classes of Bengal, but as a religious faith it remained confined to few, among whom, however, were some outstanding persons and families. But even these families, though ardently interested in social and religious reform, tended to go back to the old Indian philosophic ideals of the Vedanta. Elsewhere in India also the same tendencies were at work, and dissatisfaction arose at the rigid social forms and protean character of Hinduism as practiced. One of the most notable reform movements was started in the second half of the 19th century by a Gujarati, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, but it took root among the Hindus of the Punjab. This was the Arya Samaj, and its slogan was "Back to the Vedas." This slogan really meant an elimination of developments of the Aryan faith since the Vedas, the Vedanta philosophy as it subsequently developed, the central conception of monism, the pantheistic outlook, as well as popular and cruder developments, were all alike severely condemned. Even the Vedas were interpreted in a particular way. The Arya Samaj was a reaction to the influence of Islam and Christianity, more especially the former. It was a crusading and reforming movement from within, as well as a defensive organization for protection against external attacks. It introduced proselytization into Hinduism, and thus, tended to come into conflict with other proselytizing religions. The Arya Samaj, which had been a close approach to Islam, tended to become a defender of everything Hindu, against what it considered as the encroachments of other faiths. It is significant that it spread chiefly among the middle-class Hindus of the Punjab and the United Provinces. At one time it was considered by the government as a politically revolutionary movement, but the large numbers of government servants in it made it thoroughly respectable. It has done very good work in the spread of education both among boys and girls, in improving the condition of women, and in raising the status and standards of the depressed classes. About the same period as Swami Dayanand, a different type of person lived in Bengal, and his life influenced many of the new English-educated classes. He was Sri Ram Krishna Paramhans, a simple man, no scholar but a man of faith, and not interested in social reform as such. He was in a direct line with Chaitanya and other Indian saints. Essentially religious and yet broad-minded, in his search for self-realization he had even met Muslim and Christian mystics, some of whom lived with him for some time. He settled down at Dakshineshwar, near Calcutta, and his extraordinary personality and character gradually attracted attention. People who went to visit him, and some who were even inclined to scoff at this simple man of faith, were powerfully influenced, and many who had been completely westernized felt that here was something they had missed. Stressing the essentials of religious faith, he linked up the various aspects of the Hindu religion and philosophy, and seemed to represent all of them in his own person. Indeed, he brought within his fold other religions also. Opposed to all sectarianism, he emphasized that all roads lead to truth. He was like some of the saints we read about in the past records of Asia and Europe. Difficult to understand in the context of modern life, and yet fitting into India's many-colored pattern, and accepted and revered by many of her people as a man with a touch of the divine fire about him. His personality impressed itself on all who saw him, and many who never saw him have been influenced by the story of his life. Among these latter is Raman Rolland, who has written a story of his life and that of his chief disciple, Swami Vivekanand. Vivekanand, together with his brother disciples, founded the non-sectarian Ramakrishna mission of service. Rooted in the past and full of pride in India's heritage, Vivekanand was yet modern in his approach to life's problems and was a kind of bridge between the past of India and her present. He was a powerful orator in Bengali and English and a graceful writer of Bengali prose and poetry. He was a fine figure of a man, imposing, full of poise and dignity, sure of himself and his mission, and at the same time full of a dynamic and fiery energy and a passion to push India forward. He came as a tonic to the depressed and demoralized Hindu mind and gave it self-reliance and some roots in the past. He attended the Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, spent over a year in the USA, traveled across Europe, going as far as Athens and Constantinople, and visited Egypt, China, and Japan. Wherever he went, he created a minor sensation not only by his presence but by what he said and how he said it. Having seen this Hindu sannyasi once, it was difficult to forget him or his message. In America, he was called the cyclonic Hindu. He was himself greatly influenced by his travels in Western countries. He admired British perseverance and the vitality and spirit of equality of the American people. America is the best field in the world to carry on any idea, he wrote to a friend in India. But he was not impressed by the manifestations of religion in the West, and his faith in the Indian philosophical and spiritual background became firmer. India, in spite of her degradation, still represented to him the light. He preached the monism of the Advaita philosophy of the Vedanta and was convinced that only this could be the future religion of thinking humanity. For the Vedanta was not only spiritual, but rational and in harmony with scientific investigations of external nature. This universe has not been created by any extra cosmic god, nor is it the work of any outside genius. It is self-creating, self-dissolving, self-manifesting, one infinite existence, the Brahma. The Vedanta ideal was of the solidarity of man and his inborn divine nature. To see God in man is the real God vision. Man is the greatest of all beings. But the abstract Vedanta must become living, poetic, in everyday life. Out of hopelessly intricate mythology must come concrete moral forms, and out of bewildering yogism must come the most scientific and practical psychology. India had fallen because she had narrowed herself, gone into her shell and lost touch with other nations, and thus sunk into a state of mummified and crystallized civilization. Caste, which was necessary and desirable in its early forms, and meant to develop individuality and freedom, had become a monstrous degradation, the opposite of what it was meant to be, and had crushed the masses. Caste was a form of social organization which was and should be kept separate from religion. Social organizations should change with the changing times. Passionately, Vivekananda condemned the meaningless metaphysical discussions and arguments about ceremonials and especially the touch-me-notism of the upper caste. Our religion is in the kitchen. Our God is the cooking pot, and our religion is, don't touch me, I am holy. He kept away from politics and disapproved of the politicians of his day. But again and again, he laid stress on the necessity for liberty and equality, and the raising of the masses. Liberty of thought and action is the only condition of life, of growth and well-being. Where it does not exist, the man, the race, the nation must go. The only hope of India is from the masses. The upper classes are physically and morally dead. He wanted to combine Western progress with India's spiritual background. Make a European society with India's religion. Become an Occidental of Occidentals in your spirit of equality, freedom, work, and energy, and at the same time a Hindu to the very backbone in religious culture and instincts. Progressively, Vivekananda grew more international in outlook, even in politics and sociology. Problems that were only national 20 years ago can no longer be solved on national grounds only. They are assuming huge proportions, gigantic shapes. They can only be solved when looked at in the broader light of international grounds. International organizations, international combinations, international laws are the cry of the day. That shows solidarity. In science, every day they are coming to a similar broad view of matter. And again, there cannot be any progress without the whole world following in the wake, and it is becoming every day clearer that the solution of any problem can never be attained on racial, or national, or narrow grounds. Every idea has to become broad till it covers the whole of this world. Every aspiration must go on increasing till it has engulfed the whole of humanity, nay the whole of life, within its scope. All this fitted in with Vivekananda's view of the Vedanta philosophy, and he preached this from end to end of India. I am thoroughly convinced that no individual or nation can live by holding itself apart from the community of others, and wherever such an attempt has been made under false ideas of greatness, policy or holiness, the result has always been disastrous to the secluding one. The fact of our isolation from all the other nations of the world is the cause of our degeneration, and its only remedy is getting back into the current of the rest of the world. Motion is the sign of life. He once wrote, I am a socialist not because I think it is a perfect system, but half a loaf is better than no bread. The other systems have been tried and found wanting. Let this one be tried, if for nothing else, for the novelty of the thing. Vivekananda spoke of many things, but the one constant refrain of his speech and writing was, obey, be fearless, be strong. For him man was no miserable sinner but a part of divinity, why should he be afraid of anything? If there is a sin in the world it is weakness, avoid all weakness, weakness is sin, weakness is death. That had been the great lesson of the Upanishads. Fear breeds evil and weeping and wailing. There had been enough of that, enough of softness. What our country now wants are muscles of iron and nerves of steel, gigantic wills which nothing can resist, which can penetrate into the mysteries and the secrets of the universe, and will accomplish their purpose in any fashion, even if it meant going down to the bottom of the ocean, and meeting death face to face. He condemned occultism and mysticism, these creepy things. There may be great truths in them, but they have nearly destroyed us, and here is the test of truth: anything that makes you weak physically, intellectually, and spiritually, reject as poison. There is no life in it, it cannot be true. Truth is strengthening. Truth is purity, truth is all knowledge. These mysticisms, in spite of some grains of truth in them, are generally weakening. Go back to your Upanishads, the shining, the strengthening, the bright philosophy, and part from all these mysterious things, all these weakening things. Take up this philosophy. The greatest truths are the simplest things in the world, simple as your own existence. And beware of superstition. I would rather see every one of you rank atheists than superstitious fools, for the atheist is alive, and you can make something of him. But if superstition enters, the brain is gone, the brain is softening, degradation has seized upon the life. Mystery-mongering and superstition are always signs of weakness. Footnote: most of these extracts have been taken from lectures from Colombo to Almoda by Swami Vivekanand, 1933, and letters of Swami Vivekanand, 1942, both published by the Advaita Ashram, Mayavati, Almoda, Himalayas. In the letters, page 390, there is a remarkable letter written by Vivekanand to a Muslim friend. In the course of this, he writes, whether we call it Vedantism or any ism, the truth is that Advaitism is the last word of religion and thought, and the only position from which one can look upon all religions and sects with love. We believe it is the religion of the future enlightened humanity. The Hindus may get the credit of arriving at it earlier than other races, they being an older race than either the Hebrew or the Arab, yet practical Advaitism, which looks upon and behaves to all mankind as one's own soul, is yet to be developed among the Hindus universally. On the other hand, our experience is that if ever the followers of any religion approach to this equality in an appreciable degree in the plane of practical workaday life, it may be quite unconscious generally of the deeper meaning and the underlying principle of such conduct, which the Hindus as a rule so clearly perceive. It is those of Islam and Islam alone. For our own motherland, adjunction of the two great systems, Hinduism and Islam, Vedanta brain and Islam body, is the only hope. I see in my mind's eye the future perfect India rising out of this chaos and strife, glorious and invincible, with Vedanta brain and Islam body. This letter is dated Almoda, June 10, 1898. End of footnote. So Vivekanand thundered from Cape Comorin on the southern tip of India to the Himalayas, and he wore himself out in the process, dying in 1902 when he was 39 years of age. A contemporary of Vivekanand, and yet belonging much more to a later generation, was Rabindranath Tagore. The Tagore family had played a leading part in various reform movements in Bengal during the 19th century. There were men of spiritual stature in it, and fine writers and artists, but Rabindranath towered above them all, and indeed all over India his position gradually became one of unchallenged supremacy. His long life of creative activity covered 2 entire generations, and he seems almost of our present day. He was no politician, but he was too sensitive and devoted to the freedom of the Indian people to remain always in his ivory tower of poetry and song. Again and again he stepped out of it, when he could tolerate some development no longer, and in prophetic language warned the British government or his own people. He played a prominent part in the Swadeshi movement that swept through Bengal in the first decade of the 20th century, and again when he gave up his knighthood at the time of the Amritsar massacre. His constructive work in the field of education, quietly begun, has already made Shanti Niketan one of the focal points of Indian culture. His influence over the mind of India, and specially of successive rising generations, has been tremendous. Not Bengali only, the language in which he himself wrote, but all the modern languages of India have been molded partly by his writings. More than any other Indian, he has helped to bring into harmony the ideals of the East and the West, and broadened the bases of Indian nationalism. He has been India's internationalist par excellence, believing and working for international cooperation, taking India's message to other countries and bringing their message to his own people. And yet with all his internationalism, his feet have always been planted firmly on India's soil, and his mind has been saturated with the wisdom of the Upanishads. Contrary to the usual course of development, as he grew older, he became more radical in his outlook and views. Strong individualist as he was, he became an admirer of the great achievements of the Russian Revolution, especially in the spread of education, culture, health, and the spirit of equality. Nationalism is a narrowing creed, and nationalism in conflict with a dominating imperialism produces all manner of frustrations and complexes. It was Tagore's immense service to India, as it has been Gandhi's in a different plane, that he forced the people in some measure out of their narrow grooves of thought, and made them think of broader issues affecting humanity. Tagore was the great humanist of India. Tagore and Gandhi have undoubtedly been the two outstanding and dominating figures of India in this first half of the 20th century. It is instructive to compare and contrast them. No two persons could be so different from one another in their makeup or temperaments. Tagore, the aristocratic artist turned democrat with proletarian sympathies, represented essentially the cultural tradition of India, the tradition of accepting life in the fullness thereof and going through it with song and dance. Gandhi, more a man of the people, almost the embodiment of the Indian peasant, represented the other ancient tradition of India, that of renunciation and asceticism. And yet, Tagore was primarily the man of thought, Gandhi of concentrated and ceaseless activity. Both, in their different ways, had a world outlook, and both were at the same time wholly Indian. They seemed to present different but harmonious aspects of India and to complement one another. Tagore and Gandhi bring us to our present age. But we were considering an earlier period and the effect produced on the people, and especially the Hindus, by the stress laid by Vivekanand and others on the past greatness of India and their pride in it. Vivekanand himself was careful to warn his people not to dwell too much on the past, but to look to the future. When, O Lord, he wrote, shall our land be free from this eternal dwelling upon the past? But he himself and others had evoked that past, and there was a glamour in it, and no getting away from it. This looking back to the past and finding comfort and sustenance there was helped by a renewed study of ancient literature and history, and later by the story of the Indian colonies in the eastern seas, as this unfolded itself. Mrs. Annie Besant was a powerful influence in adding to the confidence of the Hindu middle classes in their spiritual and national heritage. There was a spiritual and religious element about all this, and yet there was a strong political background to it. The rising middle classes were politically inclined and were not so much in search of a religion, but they wanted some cultural roots to cling on to, something that gave them assurance of their own worth, something that would reduce the sense of frustration and humiliation that foreign conquest and rule had produced. In every country with a growing nationalism, there is this search apart from religion, this tendency to go to the past. Iran, without in any way weakening in its religious faith, has deliberately gone back to its pre-Islamic days of greatness and utilized this memory to strengthen its present-day nationalism. So also in other countries. The past of India, with all its cultural variety and greatness, was a common heritage of all the Indian people, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, and others, and their ancestors had helped to build it. The fact of subsequent conversion to other faiths did not deprive them of this heritage, just as the Greeks, after their conversion to Christianity, did not lose their pride in the mighty achievements of their ancestors, or the Italians in the great days of the Roman Republic and early empire. If all the people of India had been converted to Islam or Christianity, her cultural heritage would still have remained to inspire them, and give them that poise and dignity, which a long record of civilized existence with all its mental struggles with the problems of life gives a people. If we had been an independent nation, all of us in this country working together in the present for a common future would no doubt have looked to our common past with equal pride. Indeed, during the Mughal period, the emperors and their chief associates, newcomers as they were, wanted to identify themselves with that past and to share it with others. But the accidents and processes of history, helped no doubt by man's policy and weaknesses, worked differently, and the changes which came prevented normal development. One would have expected that the new middle class, which was the product of the impact from the West and of technological and economic changes, would have a common background in Hindu and Muslim alike. To some extent this was so, and yet differences arose which were not present, or were present in far lesser degree, in the feudal and semi-feudal classes and the masses. The Hindu and Muslim masses were hardly distinguishable from each other. The old aristocracy had developed common ways and standards. They yet followed a common culture and had common custom and festivals. The middle classes began to diverge psychologically, and later, in other ways. To begin with, the new middle classes were almost absent among the Muslims. Their avoidance of Western education, their keeping away from trade and industry, and their adherence to feudal ways, gave a start to the Hindus which they profited by and retained. British policy was inclined to be pro-Hindu and anti-Muslim, except in the Punjab, where Muslims took more easily to Western education than elsewhere. But the Hindus had got a big start long before the British took possession of the Punjab. Even in the Punjab, though conditions were more equal for the Hindu and Muslim, the Hindus had an economic advantage. Anti-foreign sentiment was shared alike by the Hindu and Muslim aristocracy and the masses. The revolt of 1857 was a joint affair, but in its suppression Muslims felt strongly, and to some extent rightly, that they were the greater sufferers. This revolt also put an end finally to any dreams or fantasies of the revival of the Delhi Empire. That empire had vanished long ago, even before the British arrived upon the scene. The Marathas had smashed it and controlled Delhi itself. Ranjit Singh ruled in the Punjab. Mughal rule had ended in the north without any intervention of the British, and in the south also it had disintegrated. Yet the Shadow Emperor sat in the Delhi palace, and though he had become a dependent and pensioner of the Marathas and the British successively, still he was a symbol of a famous dynasty. Inevitably, during the revolt, the rebels tried to take advantage of this symbol, in spite of his weakness and unwillingness. The ending of the revolt meant also the smashing of the symbol. As the people recovered slowly from the horror of the mutiny days, there was a blank in their minds, a vacuum which sought for something to fill it. Of necessity, British rule had to be accepted, but the break with the past had brought something more than a new government. It had brought doubt and confusion and a loss of faith in themselves. That break indeed had come long before the mutiny, and had led to the many movements of thought in Bengal and elsewhere, to which I have already referred. But the Muslims generally had then retired into their shells far more than the Hindus, avoided Western education, and lived in daydreams of a restoration of the old order. There could be no more dreaming now, but there had to be something to which they could cling on. They still kept away from the new education. Gradually and after much debate and difficulty, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan turned their minds towards English education and started the Aligarh College. That was the only avenue leading to government service, and the lure of that service proved powerful enough to overcome old resentments and prejudices. The fact that Hindus had gone far ahead in education and service was disliked, and proved a powerful argument to do likewise. Parsis and Hindus were also going ahead in industry, but Muslim attention was directed to government service alone. But even this new direction to their activities, which was really confined to comparatively few, did not resolve the doubt and confusion of their minds. Hindus, in like straits, had looked back and sought consolation in ancient times. Old philosophy and literature, art and history, had brought some comfort. Ram Mohan Roy, Dayanand, Vivekanand, and others had started new movements of thought. While they drank from the rich streams of English literature, their minds were also full of ancient sages and heroes of India, their thoughts and deeds, and of the myths and traditions which they had imbibed from their childhood. Much of this was common to the Muslim masses, who were well acquainted with these traditions. But it began to be felt, especially by the Muslim upper classes, that it was not quite proper for them to associate themselves with these semi-religious traditions, that any encouragement of them would be against the spirit of Islam. They searched for their national roots elsewhere. To some extent they found them in the Afghan and Mughal periods of India, but this was not quite enough to fill the vacuum. Those periods were common for Hindus and Muslims alike, and the sense of foreign intrusion had disappeared from Hindu minds. The Mughal rulers were looked upon as Indian national rulers, though in the case of Aurangzeb there was a difference of opinion. It is significant that Akbar, whom the Hindus especially admired, has not been approved of in recent years by some Muslims. Last year the 400th anniversary of his birth was celebrated in India. All classes of people, including many Muslims, joined, but the Muslim League kept aloof because Akbar was a symbol of India's unity. This search for cultural roots led Indian Muslims, that is, some of them of the middle class, to Islamic history, and to the periods when Islam was a conquering and creative force in Baghdad, Spain, Constantinople, Central Asia, and elsewhere. There had always been interest in this history and some contacts with neighboring Islamic countries. There was also the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, which brought Muslims from various countries together. But all such contacts were limited and superficial and did not really affect the general outlook of Indian Muslims, which was confined to India. The Afghan kings of Delhi, especially Muhammad Tughlaq, had acknowledged the Caliph, at Cairo. The Ottoman emperors at Constantinople subsequently became the Caliphs, but they were not recognized as such in India. The Mughal emperors in India recognized no Khalifa or spiritual superiors outside India. It was only after the complete collapse of the Mughal power early in the 19th century that the name of the Turkish Sultan began to be mentioned in Indian mosques. This practice was confirmed after the mutiny. Thus, Indian Muslims sought to derive some psychological satisfaction from a contemplation of Islam's past greatness, chiefly in other countries, and in the fact of the continuance of Turkey as an independent Muslim power, practically the only one left. This feeling was not opposed to or in conflict with Indian nationalism. Indeed, many Hindus admired and were well acquainted with Islamic history. They sympathized with Turkey because they considered the Turks as Asiatic victims of European aggression. Yet the emphasis was different, and in their case that feeling did not supply a psychological need as it did in the case of the Muslims. After the mutiny, the Indian Muslims had hesitated which way to turn. The British government had deliberately repressed them to an even greater degree than it had repressed the Hindus, and this repression had especially affected those sections of the Muslims from which the new middle class, the bourgeois, might have been drawn. They felt down and out and were intensely anti-British as well as conservative. British policy towards them underwent a gradual change in the 70s and became more favorable. This change was essentially due to the policy of balance and counterpoise which the British government had consistently pursued. Still, in this process, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan played an important part. He was convinced that he could only raise the Muslims through cooperation with the British authorities. He was anxious to make them accept English education, and thus to draw them out of their conservative shells. He had been much impressed by what he had seen of European civilization, and indeed, some of his letters from Europe indicate that he was so dazed that he had rather lost his balance. Sir Syed was an ardent reformer, and he wanted to reconcile modern scientific thought with Islam. This was to be done, of course, not by attacking any basic belief, but by a rationalistic interpretation of scripture. He pointed out the basic similarities between Islam and Christianity. He attacked purdah, the seclusion of women, among the Muslims. He was opposed to any allegiance to the Turkish Caliphate. Above all, he was anxious to push a new type of education. The beginnings of the national movement frightened him, for he thought that any opposition to the British authorities would deprive him of their help in his educational program. That help appeared to him to be essential, and so he tried to tone down anti-British sentiments among the Muslims, and to turn them away from the National Congress which was taking shape then. One of the declared objects of the Aligarh College he founded was to make the Mussulmans of India worthy and useful subjects of the British Crown. He was not opposed to the National Congress because he considered it predominantly a Hindu organization. He opposed it because he thought it was politically too aggressive, though it was mild enough in those days, and he wanted British help and cooperation. He tried to show that Muslims as a whole had not rebelled during the mutiny, and that many had remained loyal to the British power. He was in no way anti-Hindu or communally separatist. Repeatedly, he emphasized that religious differences should have no political or national significance. "Do you not inhabit the same land?" he said. "Remember that the words Hindu and Mohammedan are only meant for religious distinction, otherwise all persons, whether Hindu or Mohammedan, even the Christians who reside in this country, are all in this particular respect belonging to one and the same nation." Sir Syed Ahmed Khan's influence was confined to certain sections of the upper classes among the Muslims. He did not touch the urban or rural masses. These masses were almost completely cut off from their upper classes, and were far nearer to the Hindu masses. While some among the Muslim upper classes were descendants of the ruling groups during Mughal times, the masses had no such background or tradition. Most of them had been converted from the lowest strata of Hindu society and were most unhappily situated, being among the poorest and the most exploited. Sir Syed had a number of able and notable colleagues. In his rationalistic approach he was supported, among others, by Sayyid Chirag Ali and Nawab Mohsin ul-Mulk. His educational activities attracted Munshi Karamat Ali, Munshi Zakallah, of Delhi, Dr. Nazid Ahmed, Maulana Shibli Nomani, and the poet Hali, who is one of the outstanding figures of Urdu literature. Sir Syed succeeded in so far as the beginnings of English education among the Muslims were concerned, and in diverting the Muslim mind from the political movement. A Mohammedan educational conference was started, and this attracted the rising Muslim middle class in the professions and services. Nonetheless, many prominent Muslims joined the National Congress. British policy became definitely pro-Muslim, or rather in favor of those elements among the Muslims who were opposed to the national movement. But early in the 20th century the tendency towards nationalism in political activity became more noticeable among the younger generation of Muslims. To divert this and provide a safe channel for it, the Muslim League was started in 1906 under the inspiration of the British government and the leadership of one of its chief supporters, the Aga Khan. The League had two principal objects: loyalty to the British government and the safeguarding of Muslim interests. It is worth noting that during the post-mutiny period all the leading men among Indian Muslims, including Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, were products of the old traditional education, although some of them added knowledge of English later and were influenced by new ideas. The new Western education had yet produced no notable figure among them. The leading poet in Urdu and one of the outstanding literary figures of the century in India was Ghalib, who was in his prime before the mutiny. In the early years of the 20th century there were two trends among the Muslim intelligentsia: one, chiefly among the younger element, was towards nationalism, the other was a deviation from India's past and even, to some extent, her present, and a greater interest in Islamic countries, especially Turkey, the seat of the Caliphate. The pan-Islamic movement, encouraged by Sultan Abdulhamid of Turkey, had found some response in the upper strata of Indian Muslims, and yet Sir Syed had opposed this and written against Indians interesting themselves in Turkey and the Sultanate. The Young Turk movement produced mixed reactions. It was looked upon with some suspicion by most Muslims in India to begin with, and there was general sympathy for the Sultan, who was considered a bulwark against the intrigues of European powers in Turkey. But there were others, among them Abul Kalam Azad, who eagerly welcomed the Young Turks and the promise of constitutional and social reform that they brought. When Italy suddenly attacked Turkey in the Tripoli War of 1911, and subsequently, during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, an astonishing wave of sympathy for Turkey roused Indian Muslims. All Indians felt that sympathy and anxiety, but in the case of Muslims this was keener and something almost personal. The last remaining Muslim power was threatened with extinction, the sheet anchor of their faith in the future was being destroyed. Dr. M.A. Ansari led a strong medical mission to Turkey and even the poor subscribed. Money came more rapidly than for any proposal for the uplift of the Indian Muslims themselves. World War I was a time of trial for the Muslims because Turkey was on the other side. They felt helpless and could do nothing. When the war ended, their pent-up feelings were to break out in the Caliphate movement. The year 1912 was notable also in the development of the Muslim mind in India because of the appearance of two new weeklies, the Al-Hilal in Urdu and the Comrade in English. The Al-Hilal was started by Abul Kalam Azad, the present Congress president, a brilliant young man of 24, who had received his early education in Al-Azhar University of Cairo, and while yet in his teens, had become well known for his Arabic and Persian scholarship and deep learning. To this, he added a knowledge of the Islamic world outside India, and of the reform movements that were coursing through it, as well as of European developments. Rationalist in outlook, and yet, profoundly versed in Islamic lore and history, he interpreted scripture from a rationalist point of view. Soaked in Islamic tradition and with many personal contacts with prominent Muslim leaders and reformers in Egypt, Turkey, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, and Iran, he was powerfully affected by political and cultural developments in these countries. Because of his writings he was known in the Islamic countries probably more than any other Indian Muslim. The wars in which Turkey became involved aroused his intense interest and sympathy, and yet his approach was different from that of the older Muslim leaders. He had a wider and more rationalist outlook, which kept him away from the feudal and narrowly religious and separatist approach of these older leaders, and inevitably made him an Indian nationalist. He had himself seen nationalism growing in Turkey and the other Islamic countries, and he applied that knowledge to India, and saw in the Indian national movement a similar development. Other Muslims in India were hardly aware of these movements elsewhere, and wrapped up in their own feudal atmosphere, had little appreciation of what was happening there. They thought in religious terms only, and if they sympathized with Turkey, it was chiefly because of that religious bond. In spite of that intense sympathy, they were not in tune with the nationalist and rather secular movements in Turkey. Abul Kalam Azad spoke in a new language to them in his weekly Al-Hilal. It was not only a new language in thought and approach, even its texture was different, for Azad's style was tense and virile, though sometimes a little difficult because of its Persian background. He used new phrases for new ideas and was a definite influence in giving shape to the Urdu language, as it is today. The older conservative leaders among the Muslims did not react favorably to all this and criticized Azad's opinions and approach. Yet not even the most learned of them could easily meet Azad in debate and argument, even on the basis of scripture and old tradition, for Azad's knowledge of these happened to be greater than theirs. He was a strange mixture of medieval scholasticism, 18th-century rationalism, and the modern outlook. There were a few among the older generation who approved of Azad's writings, among them being the learned Maulana Shibli Nomani, who had himself visited Turkey, and who had been associated with Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan in Aligarh College. The tradition of Aligarh College was, however, different and conservative, both politically and socially. Its trustees came from among the princes and big landlords, typical representatives of the feudal order. Under a succession of English principles, closely associated with government circles, it had fostered separatist tendencies and an anti-nationalist and anti-Congress outlook. The chief aim kept before its students was to enter government service in the subordinate ranks. For that a pro-government attitude was necessary and no truck with nationalism and sedition. The Aligarh College group had become the leaders of the new Muslim intelligentsia and influenced sometimes openly, more often from behind the scenes, almost every Muslim movement. The Muslim League came into existence largely through their efforts. Abul Kalam Azad attacked this stronghold of conservatism and anti-nationalism not directly but by spreading ideas which undermined the Aligarh tradition. This very youthful writer and journalist caused a sensation in Muslim intellectual circles, and though the elders frowned upon him, his words created a ferment in the minds of the younger generation. That ferment had already started because of events in Turkey, Egypt, and Iran, as well as the development of the Indian nationalist movement. Azad gave a definite trend to it by pointing out that there was no conflict between Islam and sympathy for Islamic countries and Indian nationalism. This helped in bringing the Muslim League nearer to the Congress. Azad had himself joined the League, whilst yet a boy, at its first session in 1906. The Al-Hilal was not approved of by the representatives of the British government. Securities were demanded from it under the Press Act and ultimately its press was confiscated in 1914. Thus ended the Al-Hilal after a brief existence of 2 years. Azad thereupon brought out another weekly, the Al-Balag, but this, too, ended in 1916 when Azad was interned by the British government. For nearly 4 years he was kept in internment, and when he came out at last, he took his place immediately among the leaders of the National Congress. Ever since then he has been continuously in the highest Congress executive, looked upon, in spite of his youthful years, as one of the elders of the Congress, whose advice both in national and political matters as well as in regard to the communal and minority questions is highly valued. Twice he had been Congress president, and repeatedly he has spent long terms in prison. The other weekly that was started in 1912, some months before the Al-Hilal, was the Comrade. This was in English and it influenced especially the younger English-educated generation of Muslims. It was edited by Maulana Muhammad Ali, who was an odd mixture of Islamic tradition and an Oxford education. He began as an adherent of the Aligarh tradition and was opposed to any aggressive politics. But he was far too able and dynamic a personality to remain confined in that static framework, and his language was always vigorous and striking. The annulment of the partition of Bengal in 1911 had given him a shock, and his faith in the bona fides of the British government had been shaken. The Balkan Wars moved him, and he wrote passionately in favor of Turkey and the Islamic tradition it represented. Progressively, he grew more anti-British, and the entry of Turkey in World War I completed the process. A famous and enormously long article of his speeches and writings did not err on the side of brevity or conciseness, in the Comrade entitled The Choice of the Turks put an end to the Comrade, which was stopped by the government. Soon after, government arrested him and his brother Shaukat Ali, and interned them for the duration of the war and a year after. They were released at the end of 1919 and both immediately joined the National Congress. The Ali brothers played a very prominent part in the Caliphate agitation and in Congress politics in the early 20s and suffered prison for it. Muhammad Ali presided over an annual session of the Congress and was for many years a member of its highest executive committee. He died in 1930. The change that took place in Muhammad Ali was symbolic of the changing mentality of the Indian Muslims. Even the Muslim League, founded to isolate the Muslims from nationalist currents and completely controlled by reactionary and semi-feudal elements, was forced to recognize the pressure from the younger generation. It was drifting, though somewhat unwillingly, with the tide of nationalism and coming nearer to the Congress. In 1913 it changed its creed of loyalty to government to a demand for self-government for India. Maulana Abul Kalam Azad had advocated this change in his forceful writings in the Al-Hilal. End of Part 10, titled, Reform and Other Movements Among Hindus and Muslims, of Chapter 7. Part 11, Kemal Pasha, Nationalism in Asia, Iqbal. Kemal Pasha was naturally popular in India with Muslims and Hindus alike. He had not only rescued Turkey from foreign domination and disruption but had foiled the machinations of European imperialist powers, especially England. But as the Ataturk's policy unfolded itself, his lack of religion, his abolition of the Sultanate and Caliphate, the building up of a secular state, and his disbandment of religious orders, that popularity waned so far as the more orthodox Muslims were concerned and a silent resentment against his modernist policy rose among them. This very policy, however, made him more popular among the younger generation of both Hindus and Muslims. The Ataturk partly destroyed the dream structure that had gradually grown up in the Indian Muslim mind ever since the days of the mutiny. Again, a kind of vacuum was created. Many Muslims filled this vacuum by joining the nationalist movement. Many had of course already joined it previously, others stood aloof, hesitant and doubtful. The real conflict was between feudal modes of thought and modern tendencies. The feudal leadership had for the moment been swept away by the mass Caliphate movement, but that movement itself had no solid basis in social and economic conditions, or in the needs of the masses. It had its center elsewhere, and when the core itself was eliminated by the Ataturk, the superstructure collapsed, leaving the Muslim masses bewildered and disinclined to any political action. The old feudal leaders, who had lain low, crept back into prominence, helped by British policy, which had always supported them. But they could not come back to their old position of unquestioned leadership, for conditions had changed. The Muslims were also throwing up, rather belatedly, a middle class, and the very experience of a mass political movement, under the leadership of the National Congress, had made a vital difference. Though the mentality of the Muslim masses and the new growing middle class was shaped essentially by events, Sir Muhammad Iqbal played an important part in influencing the latter, and especially the younger generation. The masses were hardly affected by him. Iqbal had begun by writing powerful nationalist poems in Urdu, which had become popular. During the Balkan Wars, he turned to Islamic subjects. He was influenced by the circumstances then prevailing and the mass feeling among the Muslims, and he himself influenced and added to the intensity of these sentiments. Yet he was very far from being a mass leader. He was a poet, an intellectual and a philosopher, with affiliations to the old feudal order. He came from Kashmiri Brahmin stock. He supplied in fine poetry, which was written both in Persian and Urdu, a philosophic background to the Muslim intelligentsia, and thus diverted its mind in a separatist direction. His popularity was no doubt due to the quality of his poetry, but even more so it was due to his having fulfilled a need when the Muslim mind was searching for some anchor to hold on to. The old pan-Islamic ideal had ceased to have any meaning. There was no caliphate, and every Islamic country, Turkey most of all, was intensely nationalist, caring little for other Islamic peoples. Nationalism was in fact the dominant force in Asia as elsewhere, and in India the nationalist movement had grown powerful and challenged British rule repeatedly. That nationalism had a strong appeal to the Muslim mind in India, and large numbers of Muslims had played a leading part in the struggle for freedom. Yet Indian nationalism was dominated by Hindus and had a Hinduist look. So a conflict arose in the Muslim mind. Many accepted that nationalism, trying to influence it in the direction of their choice. Many sympathized with it, and yet remained aloof, uncertain, and yet many others began to drift in a separatist direction for which Iqbal's poetic and philosophic approach had prepared them. This, I imagine, was the background out of which, in recent years, arose the cry for a division of India. There were many reasons, many contributory causes, errors and mistakes on every side, and especially the deliberate separatist policy of the British government. But behind all these was this psychological background, which itself was produced, apart from certain historical causes, by the delay in the development of a Muslim middle class in India. Essentially, the internal conflict in India, apart from the nationalist struggle against foreign domination, is between the remnants of the feudal order and modernist ideas and institutions. That conflict exists on the national plane as well as within each major group, Hindu, Muslim, and others. The national movement, as represented essentially by the National Congress, undoubtedly represents the historic process of growth towards these new ideas and institutions, though it tries to adapt these to some of the old foundations. Because of this, it has attracted to its fold all manner of people, differing widely among themselves. On the Hindu side, an exclusive and rigid social order has come in the way of growth, and what is more, frightened other groups. But this social order itself has been undermined, and is fast losing its rigidity, and in any event, is not strong enough to obstruct the growth of the national movement in its widest political and social sense, which has developed enough impetus to go ahead in spite of obstacles. On the Muslim side, feudal elements have continued to be strong and have usually succeeded in imposing their leadership on their masses. There has been a difference of a generation or more in the development of the Hindu and Muslim middle classes, and that difference continues to show itself in many directions, political, economic, and other. It is this lag which produces a psychology of fear among the Muslims. Pakistan, the proposal to divide India, however much it may appeal emotionally to some, is of course no solution for this backwardness, and it is much more likely to strengthen the hold of feudal elements for some time longer, and delay the economic progress of the Muslims. Iqbal was one of the early advocates of Pakistan, and yet he appears to have realized its inherent danger and absurdity. Edward Thompson has written that in the course of a conversation, Iqbal told him that he had advocated Pakistan because of his position as president of the Muslim League session, but he felt sure that it would be injurious to India as a whole and to Muslims specially. Probably he had changed his mind, or he had not given much thought to the question previously, as it had assumed no importance then. His whole outlook on life does not fit in with the subsequent developments of the idea of Pakistan or division of India. During his last years, Iqbal turned more and more towards socialism. The great progress that Soviet Russia had made attracted him. Even his poetry took a different turn. A few months before his death, as he lay on his sickbed, he sent for me, and I gladly obeyed the summons. As I talked to him about many things, I felt that how much we had in common, in spite of differences, and how easy it would be to get on with him. He was in reminiscent mood, and wandered from one subject to another, and I listened to him, talking little myself. I admired him and his poetry, and it pleased me greatly to feel that he liked me and had a good opinion of me. A little before I left him, he said to me, "What is there in common between Jinnah and you? He is a politician, you are a patriot. I hope there is still much in common between Mr. Jinnah and me. As for my being a patriot, I do not know that this is a particular qualification in these days, at least in the limited sense of the word. Greatly attached as I am to India, I have long felt that something more than national attachment is necessary for us in order to understand and solve even our own problems, and much more so those of the world as a whole." But Iqbal was certainly right in holding that I was not much of a politician, although politics had seized me and made me their victim. End of Part 11, titled, Kemal Pasha, Nationalism in Asia, Iqbal, of Chapter 7. Part 12, Heavy Industry begins, Tilak, and Gokhale, Separate Electorates. In my desire to explore the background of the Hindu-Muslim problems and understand what lay behind the new demand for Pakistan and separation, I have jumped over half a century. During this period many changes came, not so much in the external apparatus of government as in the temper of the people. Some trivial constitutional developments took place, and these are often paraded, but they made no difference whatsoever to the authoritarian and all-pervasive character of British rule, nor did they touch the problems of poverty and unemployment. In 1911, Jamshedji Tata laid the foundations of heavy industry in India by starting steel and iron works in what came to be known as Jamshedpur. Government looked with disfavor on this, and other attempts to start industries, and in no way encouraged them. It was chiefly with American expert help that the steel industry was started. It had a precarious childhood, but the War of 1914-18 came to its help. Again it languished, and was in danger of passing into the hands of British debenture holders, but nationalist pressure saved it. An industrial proletariat was growing up in India. It was unorganized and helpless, and the terribly low standards of the peasantry, from which it came, prevented wage increases and improvement. So far as unskilled labor was concerned, there were millions of unemployed persons, who could be drawn upon, and no strike could succeed in these conditions. The first trade union congress was organized round about 1920. The numbers of this new proletariat were not sufficient to make any difference to the Indian political scene. They were a bucketful in a sea of peasants and workers on the land. In the 20s, the voice of industrial labor began to be heard, but it was feeble. It might have been ignored but for the fact that the Russian Revolution had forced people to attach importance to the industrial proletariat. Some big and well-organized strikes also compelled attention. The peasant, though he was everywhere and his problem was the supreme problem of India, was even more silent and forgotten by the political leaders and government alike. The early stages of the political movement were dominated by the ideological urges of the upper middle classes, chiefly the professional classes and those looking forward to a place in the administrative machine. With the coming of age of the National Congress, which had been founded in 1885, a new type of leadership appeared, more aggressive and defiant and representing the much larger numbers of the lower middle classes as well as students and young men. The powerful agitation against the partition of Bengal had thrown up many able and aggressive leaders there of this type, but the real symbol of the new age was Bal Gangadhar Tilak, from Maharashtra. The old leadership was represented also by a Maratha, a very able and a younger man, Gopal Krishna Gokhale. Revolutionary slogans were in the air, tempers ran high and conflict was inevitable. To avoid this, the old patriarch of the Congress, Dada Bhai Nauroji, universally respected and regarded as the father of the country, was brought out of his retirement. The respite was brief and in 1907 the clash came, resulting apparently in a victory for the old moderate section. But this had been won because of organizational control and the then narrow franchise of the Congress. There was no doubt that the vast majority of politically minded people in India favored Tilak and his group. The Congress lost much of its importance and interest shifted to other activities. Terroristic activity appeared in Bengal. The example set by Russian and Irish revolutionaries was being followed. Muslim young men were also being affected by these revolutionary ideas. The Aligarh College had tried to check this tendency and now, under government inspiration, the Aga Khan and others started the Muslim League to provide a political platform for Muslims and thus keep them away from the Congress. More important still, and of vital significance to India's future development, it was decided to introduce separate electorates for Muslims. Henceforward, Muslims could only stand for election and be elected by separate Muslim electorates. A political barrier was created round them, isolating them from the rest of India and reversing the unifying and amalgamating process which had been going on for centuries, and which was inevitably being speeded up by technological developments. This barrier was a small one at first, for the electorates were very limited, but with every extension of the franchise it grew, and affected the whole structure of public and social life, like some canker which corrupted the entire system. It poisoned municipal and local self-government, and ultimately it led to fantastic divisions. There came into existence, much later, separate Muslim trade unions and students' organizations and merchants' chambers. Because the Muslims were backward in all these activities, these organizations were not real organic growths from below, but were artificially created from above, and their leadership was held by the old semi-feudal type of person. Thus, to some extent, the Muslim middle classes and even the masses were isolated from the currents of growth, which were influencing the rest of India. There were vested interests enough in India created or preserved by the British government. Now an additional and powerful vested interest was created by separate electorates. It was not a temporary evil which tended to fade away with developing political consciousness. Nurtured by official policy, it grew and spread and obscured the real problems before the country, whether political, social, or economic. It created divisions and ill-feeling where there had been none previously, and it actually weakened the favored group by increasing a tendency to depend on artificial props, and not to think in terms of self-reliance. The obvious policy in dealing with groups or minorities which were backward educationally and economically was to help them in every way to grow and make up these deficiencies, especially by a forward educational policy. Nothing of this kind was done either for the Muslims, or for other backward minorities, or for the depressed classes who needed it most. The whole argument centered in petty appointments in the subordinate public services, and instead of raising standards all round, merit was often sacrificed. Separate electorates, thus, weakened the groups that were already weak or backward. They encouraged separatist tendencies and prevented the growth of national unity. They were the negation of democracy. They created new vested interests of the most reactionary kind. They lowered standards, and they diverted attention from the real economic problems of the country which were common to all. These electorates, first introduced among the Muslims, spread to other minorities and groups till India became a mosaic of these separate compartments. Possibly they may have done some good for a little while, though I am unable to spot it, but undoubtedly the injury they have caused to every department of Indian life has been prodigious. Out of them have grown all manner of separatist tendencies, and finally the demand for a splitting up of India. Lord Morley was the Secretary of State for India when these separate electorates were introduced. He resisted them, but ultimately agreed under pressure from the Viceroy. He has pointed out in his diary the dangers inherent in such a method, and how they would inevitably delay the development of representative institutions. Probably this was exactly what the Viceroy and his colleagues intended. In the Montagu-Chelmsford Report on Indian Constitutional Reform, 1918, the dangers of these communal electorates were again emphasized. Division by creeds and classes means the creation of political camps organized against each other, and teaches men to think as partisans and not as citizens. We regard any system of communal electorates, therefore, as a very serious hindrance to the development of the self-governing principle. End of Part 12, titled, Heavy Industry Begins, Tilak, and Gokhale, Separate Electorates, of Chapter 7. This concludes the 7th chapter, titled, The Last Phase, Part 1, of the Discovery of India.